Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a grand ball or a wind-swept meadow of dandelion dreams, but with livestock, dowries, and the smell of turnips clinging stubbornly to every scrap of your clothes. You stand in the muddy square of your village, boots soaked from last week's rain that never really stopped, and you're 14. Already practically past your prime matchmaking years, if we're being honest. A goose the size of a small bear hisses at your ankles, and you take a half step sideways so you can pretend you're here voluntarily. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the square, clutching a lopsided wooden spoon you carved as an offering to the person who makes your stomach feel like it's full of sparrows. Awkward, flapping sparrows that have no sense of decorum. You watch them from the edge of the bread stall, trying not to stare too obviously. They're carrying a basket piled high with onions, balancing them on one hip like it's no big feat, and you feel your heart squeeze painfully. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers genuinely experienced romantic love the way modern people understand it, or whether affection was just an inconvenient side effect of living in the same place and sharing the same goat-related tragedies. Either way, your feelings are inconvenient. Your mother is already whispering with the neighbor about the price of geese and whether your calloused hands suggest you'd be a diligent spouse. You wish you were anywhere else. Maybe somewhere warm. Somewhere that doesn't smell like damp wool and turnips. A mainstream fact. In many medieval European villages, the manorial court had to approve marriages to ensure property lines and obligations stayed tidy. Imagine falling in love, only to learn your local lord has an opinion about your prospects. You inch closer to the bread stall. Your friend elbows you, hard, and dares you to say something charming. Your mind goes blank, except for the fact that your crush's hair looks softer than any blanket you've ever owned. So instead of anything clever, you blurt out, "Does the weather make the turnips sweeter?" They blink. You want to vanish through the floorboards, but unfortunately, you're standing on pack earth. You hold out your spoon with trembling fingers, praying it doesn't look as pathetic as you feel. They take it, or at least, they hold it between thumb and forefinger, squinting as though it might be a trick. You're fairly certain you just proposed marriage by accident. A quirky tidbit. Some young villagers used to carve spoons and combs as courting gifts because anything fancier would imply you were wealthier than you actually were, and nobody wanted to start a union under false pretenses about dowry size. Your mother keeps glancing over, pretending she's not appraising the neighboring family's goats, while you make a fool of yourself. You clear your throat. "I made it," you say, as if that isn't screamingly obvious. They look up and offer a small, polite smile that makes your knees feel like pudding. Then Margaret materializes. Margaret is everyone's problem. She's the chaperone whose gaze is sharper than any scythe in the village. She plants herself between you and your intended like a living barricade in a wool cloak. "Bread's going stale," Margaret remarks, though she never once glances at the bread. She's inspecting your hands for further spoons, possibly checking if you're planning a scandal. You mumble something about fetching water and slink away, face burning. You make it halfway across the square before you realize your crush is still holding the spoon. You turn, daring to hope, but they're already walking away, the spoon dangling awkwardly from their basket. You convince yourself this is progress. Maybe. Later, as you shovel out the cow pen, you replay every humiliating detail in your head. The spoon, the weather comment, the way you nearly tripped over a goose that was probably plotting your demise. You think, maybe this is the closest I'll ever come to choosing anything for myself. You dream that night, exhausted and cold, curled on a straw pallet that smells faintly of mildew. In the dream, you're not 14 and afraid. You're older. You're working side by side with someone who never laughs when you speak. You pass them a bucket. They take it without question. You stand together in the mud, and it feels enough. When dawn comes, you wake with the weight of reality pressing on your chest. You are a commodity, a potential alliance, a pair of hands to churn butter and mend roofs. But you're also a heart that wants, even if wanting feels as useless as a cracked spoon. The morning chores are relentless. You haul buckets, scrape frost from the trough, and try not to think about the fact that your life is already mapped out by people who never once asked what you wanted. Your father mutters about dowries over breakfast. Your mother mentions the neighbor's daughter again. Nobody mentions you. Not really. Margaret appears in the doorway before you finish eating. She asks if you'll be at the market later. You nod, dreading the idea that she'll stand watch again. But something stubborn sparks in your chest. Maybe you'll go anyway. Maybe you'll carve something smoother, something you won't feel embarrassed to offer. Maybe you'll practice your lines so you don't bring up turnips. Maybe you'll even stand a little straighter when Margaret appears. You spend the afternoon with your knife and a fresh block of wood, pretending you're not already defeated. You carve carefully, smoothing the curve of the spoon's handle, willing it to be a token worth giving. The wood curls under your thumb, warm and alive. You think about how small the moment is, how small all moments are when you don't get to choose. But you do this anyway. Because even if your life isn't yours to design, even if tomorrow someone trades you for 3 geese and the promise of fertile fields, this single piece of wood is yours. And so is the hope you refuse to let die. When the sun goes down, you set the new spoon on the shelf next to the cracked one. Just for a second, you allow yourself to imagine that the next time you hold it out, it will be received with something better than polite confusion. Maybe a smile, maybe a real conversation, maybe a moment that feels like it belongs to you. You wake up before dawn to the smell of damp straw and the low murmur of voices just outside the wall. The thatch overhead drips steadily onto the foot of your pallet. For a moment, you imagine you're still dreaming about warm bread and a room where nobody is deciding your future over the price of hens. But you blink, and the dream evaporates, leaving only the reality you can't escape. You're not in charge of your own life, not even a little. Your mother's voice is low and measured as she haggles with the neighbor. You can hear every word through the thin planks, though they pretend this isn't about you. They have good hands, she says, and you know she doesn't mean for weaving. She means for bearing children, mending tears, harvesting turnips. Your worth compressed into how well you can churn, carry, and survive. You pull your blanket over your head, willing yourself invisible. But the voices keep coming, soft as fog and just as inescapable. Historians still argue whether peasants truly had any say in their matches, or whether subtle forms of rebellion, like refusing to cooperate or running away, happened more than the records admit. You'd like to believe you could rebel. But, as your father's footsteps cross the threshold, you know today is not the day you'll find out. A mainstream fact. Marriage in medieval peasant communities wasn't always arranged in the strictest sense, but family approval was nearly mandatory. Even if you fell in love, you'd need to convince everyone else it was worth the risk. You dress quickly, scrubbing at your face to chase the tiredness away. You know what's coming. The neighbor's daughter is of good character, meaning she's never stolen an onion or insulted the priest. She's sturdy, too. The sort of person you're supposed to appreciate in a spouse. Someone with the back for farm labor and the temperament for sharing a cramped room with 3 generations. But you don't think of her. Not really. You think of the person with the basket of onions, the one who looked at your spoon like it was something more than kindling, the one who made your heart do that uncomfortable flutter you still haven't decided whether to resent or savor. You spend the morning pretending to care about the goat that keeps escaping the fence, but your eyes keep drifting to the road, imagining your crush walking by, noticing you, maybe even waving. Instead, it's Margaret who appears. Margaret with her ever-present frown and the uncanny knack for materializing precisely when you're entertaining hopeful thoughts. You should be inside, she says, as if fresh air is the first step toward ruin. Your mother's waiting. You follow her, stomach knotted. The room smells of damp wool and porridge. Your mother gestures for you to sit. The neighbor's family is here, lined up like an audience you never auditioned for. A ledger sits open on the table, ink smudged from all the negotiations. Your father clears his throat. They've agreed to 3 hens, 1 small pig, and 2 seasons' use of the south pasture. He says it like announcing the weather. Inevitable, impersonal. You nod because nodding is easier than saying what you want to say. That you'd rather marry a fence post. That you'd rather be left alone. That you're tired of being traded like a particularly stubborn sheep. A quirky tidbit. In some communities, a couple could be declared betrothed simply by exchanging gifts in front of witnesses, even if they hadn't spoken more than a few words to each other. You briefly wish you'd given your spoon in front of Margaret. Maybe then you'd have a different future. Your intended doesn't meet your eyes. She stares at her hands, which are pink and cracked from winter's soap. You think she might feel the same, trapped by duty and custom, carrying a longing neither of you are allowed to voice. The conversation goes on without you. You drift, your gaze fixed on the door, willing someone, anyone, to burst in and declare that love matters more than pigs or pastures. But no one comes, because this is real life, not a ballad. When it's over, your father pats your shoulder. It's a good match, he says, as though you've just been awarded a prize instead of a sentence. You try to smile. It feels brittle. Later, you slip away to the woodshed, seeking a moment alone. The air smells of sawdust and old rain. You take out your carving knife and another piece of wood, something to do with your hands so they don't tremble. You start another spoon. You don't even know who it's for. Maybe yourself. Maybe the dream of choosing something. You carve until the light fades and your knuckles ache. You carve until your heart quiets enough that you can breathe again. When you return to the house, everyone is eating in silence. Your mother looks up, her expression softening just enough to make something twist inside you. You know she believes this is kindness, securing your future before you're old enough to ruin it with sentiment. You sit, you eat, you pretend your life hasn't been signed away in exchange for a pig. That night, you lie awake on your straw mattress. The wind rattles the shutters. You close your eyes and imagine a different world. A world where you'd offer that spoon to someone because you wanted to, not because it would secure another field or settle an old debt. And you promise yourself, quietly, stubbornly, that you'll find some small space to be free, even if you have to carve it out, one splinter at a time. You're standing by the well, the rope rough in your palm, when you feel it. That tightness that isn't from hauling buckets or shoveling manure. It's the ache that grows when you've spent too long thinking about someone who barely knows you exist. Someone whose laugh you can pick out over any crowd, even when you know it isn't meant for you. You glance across the yard and see them. The way the morning sun lands on their hair makes you feel ridiculous, but also alive. For a moment, you almost forget that in this world, desire is an inconvenience, something to be folded into a corner and smoothed flat until it looks like nothing at all. A goose shrieks at your ankle, snapping you back to reality. You sigh. Even in your own fantasies, there's always a goose. Today isn't like yesterday, because in this imagining, you aren't a peasant with a spoon and a doomed betrothal. You're something else, something almost brave. Let's pretend, just for a little while, that you're a knight. Your armor is polished, even if your horse looks like it regrets agreeing to this arrangement. Your name carries enough weight to buy you a seat at the feast, but not enough to free you from the tyranny of longing. Because here, in this new version of you, there is a lady, and she is unattainable in every possible way. A mainstream fact, the tradition of courtly love, first flourishing in 12th century France, encouraged knights to choose an unavailable noblewoman to adore from afar, an exercise in both devotion and carefully managed suffering. You watch her across the great hall, pretending to be fascinated by the tapestries. She never looks directly at you, but sometimes you think you catch the edge of her gaze, as though she's aware of your quiet undoing. Your friends think it's hilarious how you've composed 14 increasingly terrible verses comparing her to celestial bodies. You suspect she's heard at least a few, because she once passed you in the corridor and didn't look entirely disgusted. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever sincere, or simply a sanctioned performance that allowed bored nobles to feel interesting without the inconvenience of actual adultery. You're not sure yourself. All you know is that this feeling, ridiculous, bright, and sharp, is the closest you've come to freedom in years. You wear her colors on your sleeve during the tournament. It's an old piece of silk, dyed a shade of green that makes you think of riverbanks and hope. You tilt your helmet just so, hoping she'll notice, even though she's seated next to her husband, the one whose breath always smells like pickled onions. A quirky tidbit. Some knights would lock themselves in towers or refuse food to prove the depth of their devotion. One famously tried to live on nothing but water and poetry for a month. He lasted 5 days before collapsing in the pig yard. You're not quite that foolish, but you are committed. Committed enough that you risk writing yet another poem, this one comparing her smile to a sunrise seen through arrow slits. It's not good, but it's honest. You fold it into a square and press it under a candlestick where you hope she'll find it. The waiting is agony. You watch every movement across the hall, every tilt of her head, every flick of her hand. When she finally picks up the folded parchment, your heart nearly launches itself into your throat. She doesn't read it then. She tucks it into her sleeve and returns to her conversation. You stare at the spot where it disappeared. Half terrified she'll show it to her husband, half determined that if she does, you'll simply ride away and never come back. But she doesn't. That night, you lie awake, armor discarded in the corner, listening to the wind against the shutters. You think about her hand, the way it moved when she tucked the poem away. You imagine, wildly, that it was a gesture of acceptance, or at least curiosity. You drift into sleep, picturing her reading your lines by candlelight, maybe smiling at the clumsy rhymes. It's the kind of thought that would make your squire roll his eyes, but it's yours. And in a life full of obligations and duties, it feels precious. In the morning, you find a ribbon tied to the latch of your door, pale green, the same shade as the silk you wore. You hold it in your hand, so light it might float away, and you wonder, was it deliberate? An accident? A kindness? The ambiguity is almost worse than rejection. But you can't help the way your heart lifts anyway. Because in a world where marriages are brokered like treaties, even a scrap of fabric can feel like a rebellion. You tie the ribbon around your wrist and tuck the end into your glove. It isn't a declaration. It isn't a promise. But it's something. And tonight, when you lie in your narrow bed, you'll press your palm to that ribbon and let yourself believe, for just a moment, that longing isn't always wasted. That sometimes it makes you more alive than any certainty ever could. You keep the ribbon hidden, not because you're ashamed, though part of you is, but because the moment you show it, it becomes something other people can measure, something they'll talk about. And in this world, where affection is an uninvited guest at every table, you'd rather it stay yours for a little longer. So you wear it tucked beneath your glove, the edge brushing your wrist like a secret. Each time your hand moves, you feel it. Soft, insistent, undeniable. Today, you've been assigned to the stables, brushing down horses that resent you and pretending you're not waiting for a glimpse of her. You almost manage to focus. Almost. Until you hear footsteps in the straw and look up to see her standing there. She doesn't speak. Neither do you. She lifts her hand, just slightly, and you see the folded scrap of parchment, the one you thought she might have thrown away. She doesn't hand it to you. She sets it on the edge of a grain barrel, as casual as if she were placing a basket of apples. Then she turns and walks away without a word. Your heart stutters. You wait until the barn is empty before you reach for it. The paper is warm from her palm. Inside, her writing is smaller than you imagined. Careful. You read it 3 times before you understand she's asking you to meet her at the edge of the orchard at dusk. A mainstream fact: in medieval courts, exchanging notes could be more scandalous than an entire season of glances. Some households kept ledgers of intercepted letters, evidence of intent, should reputations need defending. You tuck the note into your belt and feel like the ground might slip from under you. It's absurd, the way a piece of parchment can unmake everything you thought was steady. You spend the rest of the afternoon in a fog of anticipation. You try to rehearse what you'll say, but nothing feels right. As dusk falls, you walk to the orchard, your boots loud against the packed dirt. Each step feels like a dare, like you're challenging the entire order of things just by showing up. You find her beneath a crooked apple tree. Her hands are clasped in front of her, knuckles pale. She doesn't look up when you arrive. For a long moment, you stand in silence, the wind pushing the branches overhead into restless sighs. Finally, she speaks, softly, as if she's afraid the trees themselves will tell on her. "I didn't know," she says. "I didn't think you noticed me." You want to laugh, to tell her that noticing was never the problem, that trying to stop was, but you don't. Instead, you reach into your pocket and pull out the small token you've carved, a pendant shaped like a flower, or maybe a bird. You're not sure anymore. The important part is that it's yours, and you made it for her. She takes it, her fingertips brushing yours. The contact is brief, so brief you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention, but you feel it all the way down to your bones. A quirky tidbit: some tokens were edible. A sugared almond or a sweetmeat wrapped in linen could be both a gift and a coded message. "I find you delightful. I think of you. I risked the cook's temper to steal this." You expect her to hide the pendant away, but she doesn't. She lifts it to the last light of the evening and studies it carefully. Then she tucks it into her belt, where anyone might see. Historians still argue whether such tokens were always romantic. Maybe they were tokens of gratitude, or alliance, or ambition. But when she meets your gaze, you know this one is none of those. You don't say goodbye when you leave. There's no point. Any word spoken now will echo too loudly. Instead, you turn and walk back to the barn, each step heavier than the last. The next day, everything is the same. Chores wait, geese hiss, Margaret lurks. But you feel different, as if the world has shifted a fraction in your favor. You catch her eye across the yard. She doesn't look away, and that's how it starts. You exchange nothing more for a week. No notes, no tokens, not even a glance longer than polite. But you feel it, the invisible cord tying you to her. Each time you pass, you sense the shared understanding. We are risking everything. One morning, you find a sprig of rosemary tied to your door latch. It's not much, but it's more than you'd hoped. You slip it into your glove. It smells like memory and the promise you still don't dare name. When you walk through the market, you feel people watching you. Or maybe you only imagine it. You keep your eyes down, pretending to admire baskets of wrinkled apples. You think about how love in this world is never straightforward, never safe. But as the sun sets and you retreat to your corner of the barn, you feel a flicker of something you've almost forgotten: possibility. Because even in a life measured out in chores and bargains, you've carved something for yourself. And tonight, when you sleep, you dream not of escape, but of standing in the orchard again, just the two of you, hands brushing, hearts in your throats. The next morning begins like any other. Stiff joints, cold air, and the low mutter of your father cursing a stubborn goat. But you can feel it under your skin, the knowledge that something has shifted. You carry it through every chore, a warmth that no one else can see. You haul water, sweep straw, feed chickens that peck your boots, with the kind of disdain usually reserved for traitors. You pretend you aren't waiting for another sign, another sprig of rosemary, another look that lasts a moment too long. It doesn't come. Not that day, or the next. And you start to wonder if you imagined it all. But you can't dwell on it for long, because Margaret is watching you again. Margaret, whose self-appointed mission is to prevent even the hint of scandal. She stands by the well, pretending to sort onions, and you know she's listening to every word you say. A mainstream fact. Medieval communities relied heavily on gossip to maintain social order. It wasn't just idle chatter. It was a way to enforce expectations when there weren't enough officials to do it formally. Margaret clears her throat when you linger too long near the gate. She frowns when you glance up from your chores, and when you help lift a sack of grain onto a neighbor's cart. She crosses herself as if she's witnessed an exorcism. Historians still argue whether gossip was more harmful than helpful, whether it protected vulnerable people or simply enforced suffocating conformity. You suspect it does both. You try to be cautious, you try to keep your head down, but even caution has limits. One afternoon, while you're stacking firewood, you hear Margaret behind you. "Busy today," she observes, her tone just neutral enough to feel dangerous. You nod, not trusting yourself to speak. Her gaze flicks to your glove, the glove where you've hidden the rosemary sprig. Her mouth tightens. "You do well to remember your place," she says, "and theirs." You swallow. You want to say that you know your place better than anyone, that you feel it in every muscle, every breath, every heartbeat, but no words come. She leaves without waiting for a reply. You watch her go, shoulders stiff. When she's gone, you take the rosemary from your glove and hide it in a hollow behind the barn. You hate yourself for it, but you're tired of feeling like your heart is a crime. A quirky tidbit: some villages maintained honor courts, where neighbors could formally accuse each other of moral failings. Accusations didn't require evidence, just enough gossip to justify intervention. That night, you lie awake, replaying Margaret's words. You think about your mother's quiet resignation, your father's tired eyes, the life you're meant to accept without complaint, and you think about them. The person whose ribbon still rests against your skin, whose glance still feels like the only honest thing in a world built on transaction. The next morning, you go to the market early. The stalls are still half empty, the sky still pink with dawn. You walk past the place where you first handed over the spoon, past the well where Margaret hovers, past the bread stall where you once tried to sound clever. You find a scrap of cloth near the edge of the square, pale green, edged with careful stitches. Your heart stutters. You look around, but no one is watching. You pick it up and press it into your pocket, feeling the old, familiar ache swell inside you. Later, while you shovel manure into a barrow, you catch sight of them across the yard. They don't wave, they don't smile, but their eyes meet yours, and in that brief moment, you feel the world tilt again. you remember something your grandmother used to say, that love is most dangerous when it's quiet, when it hides behind small gestures and unsaid words, when it waits for you to be brave. You finish your work and wash your hands at the pump, the cold water biting your skin. You think about the green cloth tucked safely away, about the way you felt when you found it. Margaret passes behind you, her gaze sharp as a blade. You straighten your shoulders and meet her eyes without flinching. She frowns, but says nothing. You go home with your heart thudding in your throat, and you realize that no matter how many eyes are watching, you can't unfeel what you feel. Maybe you'll pay for it. Maybe you'll regret it. But for now, you're willing to carry that risk. And tonight, when you lie down on your straw mattress, you tuck the cloth under your cheek and let yourself believe, for just a moment, that love can be stronger than fear. You shouldn't be doing this. You know it in every taut line of your shoulders, every beat of your unsteady heart. And yet, here you are, crouched behind a stack of firewood, clutching a folded scrap of parchment that smells of candle wax and something softer you can't quite name. The night air is damp, the sort of cold that seeps into your bones. It doesn't matter. You've waited too long for this moment to let discomfort drive you back inside. You breathe slowly, counting to 10 the way your grandmother taught you when you were small. Your hands are shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything you can't say aloud. Historians still argue whether love letters were truly common among peasants or only among the literate few. You suspect it doesn't matter. If you can write, even clumsily, you'll find a way to say what your mouth cannot. A mainstream fact: some of the most famous medieval letters, like those between Eloise and Abelard, are astonishingly modern in their longing. Proof that even centuries ago, hearts betrayed themselves in ink. You press your thumb against the folded edge one last time. No signature, no names, just a single line you rewrote until it felt true. I remember your hand, the way it brushed mine like a promise. If anyone finds it, they'll assume it's nothing more than a fragment of some forgotten psalm. That's the only safety you have, the hope that no one will look closely enough to see you in it. You hear footsteps approaching, and you shrink back into the shadows. When you see them, hair half loosened from the day's work, shoulders bowed with the same exhaustion you carry, you almost lose your nerve. But you don't. When they pass, you step forward. In one movement, you slide the letter into the fold of their cloak. Your fingers graze the rough fabric of their sleeve, and your heart skitters like a startled bird. They don't look back. You stand there, half certain you've imagined the entire thing. You make yourself walk away, slowly, as if nothing has happened, as if your entire life hasn't just shifted on the strength of a single piece of parchment. Later, when you reach your pallet, you tuck your hands under your chin and stare into the darkness. You tell yourself not to hope. You fail. The next morning is agony. You move through your chores like a ghost. Every time you pass them in the yard, your stomach flips, but they give no sign they've found your note. By midday, you start to convince yourself you were foolish, that they tossed it into the fire, that they read it and laughed, that you are nothing but a daydream they'll never share. And then, just as you finish stacking the last of the split logs, you see it. Something pale tucked into the handle of your basket. You look around. No one's watching. You pull it free with hands that don't feel like yours. I remembered your hand too. It's not much, but it's enough to make the world tilt on its axis. A quirky tidbit. Some love letters were hidden in hymnals or baked into loaves of bread. Mundane objects turned into lifelines of hope. That night, you don't sleep. You lie in the dark, tracing the letters over and over with your thumb until you know every curve by heart. The next days pass in a blur of small, dangerous gestures. You slip a line of verse into a bundle of firewood. They tuck a pressed flower into your apron hem. You walk past each other without speaking, but your hands brush sometimes, just enough to set your blood humming. The world doesn't notice. Or maybe it does, but no one says a word. You start using metaphors in your letters. The garden is colder this year. The dove circled twice. Words that mean nothing to anyone else. Everything to you. One evening, you find a scrap of linen hidden in the grain bin, embroidered with a single green stitch. You tuck it into your sleeve. It feels like proof that this is real. And yet, there is always fear. Margaret eyes you more closely than ever. The priest pauses a fraction too long when he greets you after Mass. Even your mother has started to look at you with narrowed suspicion. You learn to pretend, to meet their questions with an innocent shrug, to keep your eyes fixed on your work. But inside, you burn. The last letter you write is the simplest. No code, no pretense, just a single line. If there is a way, I would choose you. You don't sign it. You don't need to. You slip it into the hollow of the orchard tree where you first stood together. And for the first time in weeks, you let yourself breathe. Because no matter what happens, you know you were brave enough to say it. When you walk home under the early stars, you feel lighter. The world is still dangerous, still watching. But tonight, your heart feels like your own. And sometimes, that is all the freedom you get. The festival arrives like a riot of color and noise, a brief reprieve from the same gray routine that has shaped your days since you were old enough to carry a pail. The entire village smells of roast meat, damp straw, and something faintly sweet. Maybe the promise that, for just one evening, you can be someone braver. You wake to the sounds of carts rumbling over the ruts in the road, merchants shouting about cloth and ribbons, and children shrieking as they chase each other around the maypole. The maypole itself stands in the square, festooned with bright ribbons that ripple in the wind. You pretend you don't care, that you're only here for chores and obligations. But in truth, you can't stop glancing toward the bread stall where you first offered your lopsided spoon. You look for them without meaning to. And when you spot them, hair caught up in a braid, sleeves rolled to their elbows, face bright in the morning sun, it feels like every reason you ever thought you'd given up. Today, you remind yourself, is different. Festivals are the only time you can flirt without risking open censure. Even Margaret, who has appointed herself the moral warden of your life, is too busy carrying baskets of barley cakes to scrutinize every glance. You try to act casual. You fail spectacularly. A mainstream fact, spring and midsummer festivals in medieval Europe were often the closest thing to sanctioned courtship. Dancing around the maypole or joining hands in a circle wasn't merely entertainment. It was the chance to signal your interest without saying a word. You hover at the edge of the square, feigning intense concentration on a jug of cider you're definitely not going to buy. You watch them help an elderly woman gather fallen apples and laugh when a child tumbles into the barrel. The sound carries across the noise, light and effortless. It shouldn't make your chest ache the way it does, but it does. When the dancing starts, you try to stay back. You tell yourself it's safer in the shadows, that you're content just to watch. But then someone pushes you forward, your friend, grinning with all the subtlety of a cart horse. Before you can protest, you're in the line of dancers, your hand extended. And then, impossible, absurd, they take it. Their palm is warm against yours, rough with work but steady. You don't look up at first. You're afraid that if you meet their eyes, you'll forget how to breathe. But as the musicians strike the first notes, you can't help yourself. They're smiling. Not the polite smile you've seen before. Something softer. Something that feels like a shared secret. Historians still argue whether these festival dances were truly a space for freedom or just another performance of expectations. You suspect it's both, because right now, you feel freer than you have in your entire life, and also terrified that someone will notice. The dance begins. You circle each other, hands brushing again and again in rhythm. Every contact is a spark. Every glance is a dare. You try to think of something clever to say. All that comes out is, your hair, before your voice fails. They tilt their head, amused. Yes? It looks nice, you stammer, wishing the ground would open and swallow you. They laugh, and it's not unkind. Thank you. You spin away, dizzy with relief and something dangerously close to happiness. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, girls would hide small tokens, ribbons, sprigs of herbs, for boys to find as part of the celebration. Sort of a medieval version of a scavenger hunt with romantic consequences. When the music pauses, you step back, heart racing. But instead of returning to the safety of the sidelines, you find yourself standing near them, hands still joined. Someone bumps into your shoulder. The connection breaks. You don't know which of you lets go first. Later, you slip away to the edge of the square. The noise of the festival becomes a soft hum, distant and unreal. You lean against a fence post and close your eyes, trying to memorize every detail of that moment. How their hand felt in yours. How their laugh made your own mouth curl up in answer. You don't notice them approach until their shadow falls over your feet. You look up. They're holding something small and folded. For you, they say. You take it, fingers clumsy. You don't unfold it there, not with the entire village within earshot, but the weight of it in your palm feels heavier than any dowry. When you finally open it, later, hidden behind the grain shed, it's only a single sentence. I liked dancing with you. Your breath leaves you in a rush. You press the scrap of paper against your chest, your heart knocking so hard it almost hurts. And when you return to the square, you do so with your head a little higher. Because for the first time, it feels like you are not just surviving. You are choosing. The morning after the festival dawns, gray and damp, as if the sky itself regrets granting you even a few hours of stolen happiness. You wake with straw in your hair, your arms aching from dancing, and a small folded scrap of parchment tucked safely beneath your blanket. You read it again before you even sit up. I liked dancing with you. the words still look impossibly plain for how they make you feel. You tuck the note inside the lining of your tunic, close to your skin, and get up to face the ordinary day. Because that's what comes next. Ordinary. The festival is over, the music has faded, Margaret is back to her rounds, and you are once again a villager with chores to complete and obligations to satisfy. Still, everything feels a fraction different. When you cross the yard with your pails of water, you spot them near the bakehouse, sleeves rolled up, hair damp from the morning mist. They glance up, and for a moment, you think they might smile. But then someone calls their name, and the moment dissolves. You keep walking, but your steps feel steadier than they did a week ago. Historians still argue whether peasants ever truly experienced romantic attachment in the way modern people imagine. Some records show marriages formed from affection, while others read like livestock ledgers. 2 names, a list of goods exchanged, a date scrawled in the margins. A mainstream fact. Free peasants in many parts of medieval Europe did have some choice in their matches, provided the union didn't disrupt obligations to the manor. But choice was always circumscribed by duty, family expectation, and survival. That's what you think about as you work side by side with your mother, pulling weeds from between rows of cabbages. You wonder if she ever felt like this, like there was someone whose nearness could crack open the careful shell she built around herself. You almost ask her, but the words catch in your throat. Instead, you listen to her hum an old tune, one you remember from when you were small enough to be carried. She doesn't look at you, but she reaches out and flicks a bit of leaf from your sleeve. It feels like something close to understanding. By the time the sun is high, the rest of the village is moving on. People are talking about winter stores and the state of the south fence. But your thoughts are stuck on that dance, that folded note, and what it means to want something you can't easily claim. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, a hand-fasting ceremony, simple, often informal, could bind 2 people together temporarily, a kind of trial marriage. After a year and a day, they could formalize it or part ways. A practical arrangement, but also a small space to choose. That evening, you go to the barn under the pretense of checking the grain sacks. You find them there, pretending to inspect a cracked yoke. Neither of you speaks for a moment. The quiet between you is so thick it feels like a third presence. Finally, you clear your throat. "I liked dancing with you," you say, voice so low you're not sure they'll hear. But they do. Their shoulders loosen, and they meet your gaze in the dim light. "Me too," they answer. You could stay there all night. But you hear footsteps outside. A cousin's voice, too close. Without thinking, you step forward and press something into their hand. A small token. A sliver of wood you carved into a shape you're not sure even counts as a symbol. Maybe it's a leaf. Maybe it's a heart. They don't look at it. They tuck it into their belt and nod once, solemn as a vow. And then you part. No more words spoken. You return to the house with your chest tight, a mix of relief and dread. You tell yourself you'll be careful, that this can't go further. But you know you're lying. In the days that follow, your lives resume their practical rhythm. You patch a roof that leaks every time it rains. You chase a goat that refuses to stay penned. You help your father haul sacks of grain so heavy, you feel them in your bones. But every time you pass each other in the yard, there's a small, quiet acknowledgement. The way their hand brushes yours when no one is looking. The way you share a smile so fleeting you'd think you imagined it. Margaret notices. Of course she does. She watches you both with her calculating stare, as if she's weighing whether to intervene. But for now, she keeps her counsel. Maybe she remembers her own youth. Maybe she's waiting for you to slip. You learn to hold your breath when she's near, to look away before anyone can accuse you of wanting what you shouldn't. But at night, when the house finally quiets, you take out the folded note and trace each letter with your thumb until you feel calmer. Because in this world, where every choice is constrained by land and custom, these stolen moments feels like your only claim to something that is yours alone. And when you sleep, you dream not of festivals or feasts, but of ordinary days, of working side by side, of hands brushing over baskets of kindling, of small gestures that matter more than any grand declaration. When you wake, the dream lingers, warm and stubborn, and you think, maybe that's enough. The day you're to be married dawns damp and unremarkable. You wake to the familiar chill seeping under the door, smell of barley porridge, and the ache in your hands that never quite goes away. It feels absurd that life continues so normally when you're about to be bound to someone by words you didn't choose. Your second best tunic is laid out for you, patched but clean, embroidered at the cuffs in a pattern your grandmother taught you. You run your fingers over the stitches, trying to feel something other than resignation. Everyone in the house moves with quiet purpose. Your father is uncharacteristically gentle as he inspects the dowry goods one last time. 3 geese, a small keg of mead, a parcel of cabbage land. Your mother fusses with your hair until you have to step away before you snap. No one asks you how you feel. No one expects you to feel anything. Historians still argue whether peasants felt any sense of occasion on their wedding day. Some records suggest it was simply another duty to fulfill, like planting turnips or patching thatch. Others hint at nervousness, even excitement. You suspect the truth is somewhere in between. Not a celebration, but a threshold you step over because you must. You walk to the church with your family in silence, the mud sucking at your boots. Along the way, neighbors nod politely, eyes flicking to the bundle of linens your mother carries. Proof that this is really happening. A mainstream fact. For most medieval Europeans, marriage wasn't primarily about love. It was a legal contract transferring property, obligations, and alliances. Even the church's blessing was as much about regulating inheritance as sanctifying affection. When you reach the door, the priest is already waiting, breath steaming in the cold air. He doesn't smile. He's recited these words too many times to pretend they mean anything special. You look across the threshold and see them. Your soon-to-be spouse. You already know the facts of their life. What land they'll inherit. How many chickens they own. What their mother expects of you. What you don't know is whether they snore, whether they hum while they work, whether they'll ever look at you the way you once hoped someone might. You stand facing each other while the priest reads the banns, intoning the required warnings about duty and fidelity. The words slide past you, muffled by the pounding in your chest. Then he gestures for you to join hands. Your palms are cold and damp, and so are theirs. For a moment, you both just stand there, hesitating. Finally, you lift your hand and they meet you halfway. Your fingers touch. Awkward, unfamiliar, undeniably real. A quirky tidbit. In some regions, the couple would stand on opposite sides of a stream or a threshold while the vows were spoken, a symbolic crossing from one life into another. You wonder if it felt less like surrender when there was something physical to step over. Your voice wavers when you repeat the vows. You hear theirs, steady but subdued, and wonder if they are thinking the same things you are. That this is necessary, that you have no choice, that you hope, quietly, foolishly, it might become something more. When the priest finally nods, it's done. You are married. There is no kiss, no applause, just the shuffle of feet and the creak of the church door as people begin to leave. Your mother presses a hand to your shoulder as if to reassure herself that you haven't changed in the space of a single ceremony. Outside, you stand with your new spouse, watching your families exchange polite congratulations. You don't quite know what to do with your hands, so you clasp them behind your back. They glance at you, only briefly, but their expression is gentler than you expect. "Shall we?" they murmur. You nod. The walk to the feast is short, but it feels like crossing an ocean. You are aware of every step, every heartbeat. You sit beside them at the table while the neighbors drink and joke and pretend this is a celebration. Someone places a stack of barley loaves on a stool. Your wedding cake, such as it is. You smile because you have to. You sip thin ale because you can't think of anything to say. Later, in the low-beamed room that will be yours, you stand side by side, listening to the muffled laughter of people drifting home. The fire crackles in the hearth. A single candle gutters on the sill. They unlace their boots with hands that tremble just a little. You clear your throat. I hope we can be kind to each other. They look at you, really look. And for the first time all day, you see something you can hold on to. "I'd like that," they say. It isn't a declaration. It isn't love. But it feels like the start of something that might survive the winter. You sit together on the edge of the bed. You don't touch. You don't rush. You just breathe the same air and let the enormity of it settle over you. And when you finally lie down, back to back, but close enough to feel each other's warmth, you think, maybe this isn't an ending. Maybe it's the first line of a story you haven't learned to read yet. Morning arrives in the quietest way. A dull gray light creeping under the shutters, the soft sound of your new spouse breathing beside you, the smell of cold ashes drifting up from the hearth. For a moment, you forget where you are. You almost expect to hear your mother's footstep on the threshold, your father clearing his throat to announce the day's chores. But then, you shift, and your elbow brushes another body. A small, startled sound escapes both of you before you each roll away, pretending the contact never happened. It isn't awkward out of dislike, just unfamiliar. Two lives that have run alongside each other for years, but never merged until now. You dress without speaking. Their shoulders are tense. Yours are too. You keep waiting for some feeling to break over you, a sudden certainty that this is right, that you are safe, that you belong here. But all you feel is a cautious emptiness, like standing on the edge of a frozen pond, testing the ice. Historians still argue whether medieval marriages gradually grew into affection or remained transactional. Some letters and wills hint at tenderness that never made it into official records. Others are blunt lists of possessions and debts. Today, your life feels somewhere in the middle, a mainstream fact. In many communities, a newlywed couple often spent the first days after the ceremony living with one set of parents, usually the groom's family, before moving into their own household. You wish someone had prepared you for what it would be like to wake in a house full of strangers who now expect you to call them kin. Your mother-in-law greets you at the door with a thin smile. She doesn't look cruel, exactly, just tired in the way people get when life has handed them too many small disappointments. "There's porridge," she says, gesturing toward the hearth. You murmur thanks and take a bowl you don't really want. Your new spouse sits across from you, staring into their own breakfast as if it might contain answers. After you've eaten, you are both dispatched to the fields. There's barley to be cut and bundled before the next rain. You work side by side, saying little, moving in the same careful rhythm. You realize how much of life is this, labor shared in silence. When your hands ache too much to continue, you straighten and glance over. They're wiping sweat from their brow, their hair coming loose from its tie. For a heartbeat, you see them not as the stranger you were assigned, but as another tired person trying to do what's expected. It softens something in you. At midday, you sit on the low wall that marks the edge of the pasture, sharing a heel of bread. You clear your throat, hesitant. "Did you want this?" you ask, because you can't bear not knowing. They don't look at you right away. When they do, their eyes are steady. "I wanted some part of it," they admit, "not the rest." You nod. That is more honesty than you expected. A quirky tidbit. In some places, couples would mark their union by carving their initials into a hidden beam of the house. A small claim of permanence in a world where so little belonged to them outright. After the meal, you both return to work. The sun sinks behind the trees. You find yourselves walking home together, steps unconsciously matched. Inside the cottage, you take turns by the basin, washing the day's grime from your hands and faces. You still don't quite know what to call each other. Friend? Partner? Just husband and wife? You think about the life ahead. Winter stores, lambing season, the roof that needs mending. A long stretch of days where your hands will share the same tasks, your bodies the same space. And you wonder if, someday, you will share more than that. You go to bed early, exhaustion making the awkwardness easier to bear. As you lie down, your shoulder brushes theirs again. This time, you don't pull away. You both pretend to sleep for a while, breathing carefully so the other can't hear how fast your heart is beating. At some point, without meaning to, you both shift closer. Your foreheads nearly touch. Their breath warms your cheek. "I don't know how to do this," you whisper, because it's the only truth you have. Their hand finds yours under the blanket. Fingers curl around yours, tentative but certain. "Me either," they say. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full of possibility. You close your eyes, and for the first time since yesterday, you feel like maybe, just maybe, this will be something worth tending. Not a grand romance, not the stuff of ballads, but something quieter, something you can build. When you finally sleep, it is deeper than you expected, because even here, in this small bed, in this small life, there is a thread of hope tying you to tomorrow. You find a rhythm more quickly than you thought you would. Not an easy one. but a rhythm all the same. You rise before dawn, your breath clouding in the dim kitchen. You learn where everything is stored, how their mother likes the grain stacked, how the latch on the back door always sticks, how your new spouse grumbles when the coals won't catch. It is, you discover, easier to share work than words. You chop wood, they gather eggs. You wash the rough clay cups. They set them back on the shelf in neat rows. These small tasks become a language you both understand. And yet, sometimes you look at each other across the table and feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing against your ribs. One morning, you find them already awake, tending the fire. Their hair is mussed from sleep. They look up, startled, as if caught doing something private. For a moment, you just watch each other in the half-light, and you think, this is my life now. It should feel suffocating. Instead, it feels like standing at the edge of a path you haven't walked yet. Historians still argue whether most medieval marriages remained practical partnerships or grew into something more affectionate. Some accounts suggest couples learned to care for each other in quiet ways, through patience, shared burdens, and the simple relief of not having to face everything alone. You hope that's true. A mainstream fact. In many communities, marriage was almost impossible to dissolve. Annulments were rare and often required evidence of fraud, impotence, or close kinship. So whether you liked each other or not, you were expected to endure. You try to be kind. They do too. When you forget to sprinkle ash over the embers, they don't scold, just sigh and help you relight the fire. When you see them carrying too heavy a load, you reach for half without thinking. It isn't love, not yet, but it's something that feels like respect. You learn other things about them, the way they hum under their breath when they're concentrating, the way they run a thumb over their lower lip when thinking, the way they always leave the last scrap of bread in the basket as if it would be greedy to finish it. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, it was believed that if you kissed your spouse across the threshold on your wedding night, it would ensure a peaceful home. You didn't do that, but sometimes, when you catch them watching you with something softer than politeness, you wonder if it matters. One evening, you sit together by the hearth, too tired to speak. The day has been long, mending a fence that collapsed under its own weight, wrangling a goat that refuses to respect any boundary, carrying water until your shoulders throb. The fire snaps, throwing sparks onto the hearthstones. Without thinking, they reach over and brush a fleck of ash from your cheek. You freeze, startled by the gentleness of it. They pull their hand back like they've been burned. Sorry, they mumble. No, you say, voice rough. It's all right. After that, something shifts. Not all at once, but enough that the silences you share become companionable instead of strained. The first time you laugh together, it surprises you, both. It's over something small. Your attempt to patch a tear in their sleeve, the stitches crooked as a drunken spider. They look down, then up at you, and you both burst into helpless laughter, the kind that leaves your ribs aching. When the laughter fades, you feel lighter. You still miss the life you left behind, the familiarity of your parents' house, the certainty of knowing exactly who you were. But you begin to see the shape of this new existence, imperfect, but yours. At night, you lie beside them in the dark, your backs not quite touching. Some evenings, your hands find each other between the blankets, fingers twining like roots. No one sees this. No one needs to. And when you wake to find their arm slung across your waist, their breath warm against your neck, you don't flinch. You close your eyes and let yourself be held. Because maybe this is how affection begins. Not with declarations or poems or festival dances, but with the slow accumulation of ordinary mercies. One morning, you catch them watching you as you braid your hair. Their expression is so open, you have to look away. "What?" you ask, heart thumping. They clear their throat. "Nothing," they say. "Just glad you're here." It isn't a love story the minstrels would sing, but it feels real in a way you didn't expect. And when you walk out together into the pale dawn, your steps matching without effort, you think, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Section 12. You don't expect the knock at the door. It's the slow, deliberate kind of knock that promises trouble, like a summons you can't ignore. You glance at your spouse, who's wiping their hands on a rag, and for a heartbeat, you both look equally guilty, though neither of you has done anything worth confessing. When you open the door, it's Father Eustace, the parish priest, dressed in a wool cloak damp with drizzle. He holds a rolled parchment as if it personally offended him. He doesn't greet you. He doesn't even clear his throat. He simply announces, in the flat tone of someone who's had a long morning, "You've been selected for census duty." You blink. "I'm sorry?" "Census duty." He gestures with the scroll, counting households, livestock, all tithable goods, begins tomorrow. Historians still argue whether medieval record-keeping was more about civic improvement or control. Some claim it was an early form of community stewardship. Others call it exactly what it felt like: the church and the manor lords finding new ways to make sure no one escaped their due. A mainstream fact. The Domesday Book of 1086 was the most famous example, but even smaller parishes conducted regular tallies of everything from cows to unmarried daughters of marriageable age. You sign the register with the charcoal stub Father Eustace hands you, your name smudging across the parchment. You wish you could make your hand stop shaking, but it won't. After he leaves, you and your spouse stare at each other. "You have to do it," they say finally. I know. They look like they might say more, but instead, they turn back to the hearth. You stand there with the scroll clutched in your hand, feeling the shape of your life shift in a way you don't have words for. The next day, you set out before sunrise, a satchel over your shoulder, your boots still wet from yesterday's rain. The first house is easy. The old widow who lives there counts everything for you. 3 goats, 2 hens, a cat she insists doesn't belong to her. By midday, you're ankle-deep in mud and 2 households behind schedule. At the 3rd house, you're bitten by a goose so belligerent it could be a reincarnated tax collector. At the 4th, a farmer tries to bribe you with a crock of mead that smells like sour apples and regret. When you finally return home, your hands are stained with ink and goose blood, and your back feels like it's been beaten with a flail. Your spouse meets you at the door, trying not to smile. "Hard day?" You glare at them. You have no idea. A quirky tidbit. Some censuses recorded truly absurd categories, like 1 wooden leg, a pet marten, or 3 loud women. You're tempted to invent a column called Men Who Won't Stop Complaining About Sheep. But even in the exhaustion, you notice something unexpected. You've seen your neighbors differently. The old man who always seems gruff. He cried when he counted his missing lambs. The young woman everyone calls lazy. She's caring for a mother who doesn't recognize her half the time. The village feels smaller now, more human. At supper, you tell your spouse about the day, about the children who tried to hide a pig in a storeroom, about the widow with the not a cat, about the goose that hates all living creatures. They listen without interrupting. When you finish, they hand you a cup of watered wine and say, simply, "I'm glad you came back." That night, you lie awake, turning over the ledger in your mind. You think about all the names you wrote down, all the lives that look, on paper, like simple lists. 2 goats, 1 hearth, 3 children. But you know how much those numbers leave out. You feel something loosen in your chest, not quite peace, but the understanding that even here, even in a world built on counting and control, people find ways to be more than what's expected. You wake early the next morning, bracing yourself for another round of door knocks and weary sighs. But when you step into the dawn, your spouse is already waiting by the gate, a small bundle of bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. For later, they say, avoiding your eyes. You take it without speaking. As you walk down the road, you press your hand against the satchel to feel the shape of the ledger inside, and you think, maybe this task isn't just about recording what exists. Maybe it's about learning to see. And in that quiet moment, you feel almost ready for whatever the day will bring. Autumn settles in with the slow, deliberate finality of a ledger closing. You feel it in the morning air, sharp as a blade when you draw your first breath. You feel it in your knees as you climb the slope to the fields, the grass wet and slick under your boots. Everywhere you look, the world is preparing for the cold. Cabbages pulled and buried in straw, beans strung up to dry, onions braided into ropes you hang in the rafters so the mice won't get them. You wake before dawn most days, lighting the hearth while your spouse rubs sleep from their eyes. Neither of you speaks much in those first gray hours, but sometimes your shoulders brush as you pass each other by the door, and you think how strange it is that something so small can feel like reassurance. Historians still argue whether peasant marriages grew warmer with time or simply became habits, too ingrained to break. You suspect it doesn't matter. Habit or affection, you've learned that sometimes just showing up is all you can do, and that can be enough. A mainstream fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, harvest time was both the busiest and most dangerous season. A poor yield could mean hunger. A slip with the scythe could mean worse. Today, you join the others in the far field, a patch of barley that refused to ripen on time. Your hands are numb within an hour, and the cold works its way up your arms like a warning. You look over and see your spouse a few rows away. They pause to stretch their back, catching your eye for the briefest moment. You offer a lopsided smile. They nod. Then you both return to work. By midday, the wind picks up. A ragged cloud bank drifts in from the north, promising rain. You work faster, cutting and binding until the straw blurs under your gaze. A quirky tidbit. Some villages held little harvest feasts even before the grain was all in. believing it bad luck to celebrate only at the end, as if the land itself needed thanks in stages. When the first drops hit your shoulders, you lift your head to the sky and close your eyes. It feels almost like relief, something bigger than you deciding the work must pause. Your spouse appears at your side, hair plastered to their forehead. "Enough," they say. And though you want to argue, you don't. You walk home together, soaked to the skin. Neither of you talks about the half-finished bundles left behind. You both know you'll return tomorrow. That evening, you sit by the hearth with your feet stretched toward the heat. You sip thin soup from a wooden bowl, your hands still trembling. They glance over and clear their throat. "I know you hate the rain," they say. "I don't hate it," you answer slowly. "I just wish it came later." They don't respond. But after a moment, they set their own bowl aside and stand. You watch as they cross to the corner, rummage in a basket and pull something out. When they sit again, they hand you a folded scrap of cloth. You unfold it to find an old kerchief, worn thin but carefully stitched along the edge. "For your hair," they mutter, eyes fixed on the fire. "So you don't catch cold." You don't know what to say. You press the kerchief to your cheek for a heartbeat, then set it in your lap. "Thank you," you whisper. In that moment, the quiet feels softer, less like an absence and more like a truce. You wake the next morning with your muscles aching, but when you sit up, you see your spouse has already lit the fire and set out a chunk of bread. You eat in silence. When you leave for the fields again, you tuck the kerchief into your pocket. A small, stubborn reminder that you aren't doing this alone. The day is long. The rain returns. But when you pass each other between rows of barley, your hands brush. Not an accident. Not entirely. Later, you stand together in the dusk, watching the last light fade behind the hedgerow. You think about all the things you haven't said, how you're afraid of the coming winter, how you sometimes still feel like an intruder in this house, how you don't know what it means to love someone you didn't choose, but you don't say any of it. Instead, you lift your hand and rest it against their sleeve, just for a moment. They look at you, eyes tired but clear, and cover your hand with theirs. Nothing more is needed, because in the end, this is how you survive. 1,000 small gestures, each one ordinary on its own, but together, something that feels like hope. The first frost comes early that year. You feel it in your joints before you see it on the fields. A deep ache at the base of your spine that warns you before the dawn does. When you open the door, you find the yard glazed in white, the chicken prints like tiny starbursts across the crusted mud. Your breath billows out in the gray hush as you step onto the stoop. You know this cold. You remember how it seeps into everything. Grain sacks, old injuries, the soft spot in your heart you've spent all summer pretending doesn't exist. You're careful with the water bucket, testing each step across the frozen ruts. Your spouse appears beside you, pulling their cloak close. You glance at each other, and though no one says it, you're both thinking the same thing. Here it comes. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly feared winter or simply met it with resignation. You suspect it depends on the person. You remember the first cold season you spent here, how your stomach nodded every time the sky turned white, and you remember how you pretended you weren't afraid. A mainstream fact In many villages, the approach of winter meant more than hunger. It meant a higher chance of sickness, since cold rooms and smoke-choked hearths bred fevers that could burn through a household in days. Inside, you stir the embers back to life, feeling the chill in your knuckles. Your spouse is already cutting onions, the smell filling the room as if to disguise the scent of damp wool. Neither of you talks much in the mornings anymore, but you notice the way they set a second cup on the table without asking if you want it. After breakfast, you bring in the last of the drying herbs, wrapping them tight in cloth against the damp. Your spouse mends the lattice over the window, and every now and then you catch them glancing at you as if they're waiting for you to admit how tired you are. You don't. But when you stand, you sway a little. "Sit down," they say, not unkindly. "I'm fine." They arch an eyebrow. You sigh and sink onto the stool. A quirky tidbit: some households hung garlands of evergreen over the door to ward off spirits that were thought to wander more freely in the long nights. You've never done that, but today you consider it, just in case. The short days bleed together. You measure them in chores. When the woodpile shrinks by half, when the first onion sprout goes soft, when the draft at the threshold feels like the wind trying to remind you who's in charge. At night, you lie side by side under blankets so heavy you can hardly turn over. In those hours, you sometimes remember the first months of your marriage, the unfamiliar shape of another body in your bed, the way you held yourself still so you wouldn't brush against them. Now, your shoulders always meet in the dark. It isn't passion that draws you close. It's something quieter, the knowledge that neither of you is going anywhere. One morning, your spouse finds you by the window, staring out at the thin light on the snow. "Thinking?" they ask. "Always," you say. "About what?" You hesitate, but there's no point in lying. "About how much of this is luck," you admit. "That we're still here, that we're not alone." Their eyes soften. They cross the room, place a hand on your shoulder. Just a touch, steady, grounding. "That's not luck," they say. "That's us." You look down, throat tight. That evening, you share stew that tastes mostly of salt. You both pretend it's better than it is. Afterward, you bring out your mending while they carve a handle for the churn. The room is so quiet that you can hear the rasp of the knife against wood, the ticking of the cooling hearth. You clear your throat. "Do you ever miss before?" you ask. They don't look up. "Before what?" "Before this. All of it." Their knife stills. "Sometimes," they admit. "But then I think about how it feels to sit here with you, how it feels to know I don't have to pretend anything." You set your mending aside, pressing a palm against your heart as if you can hold it still. "That's worth something," they say. You nod. The first heavy snow comes that night. You wake to find the world wrapped in silence, everything blurred and smoothed by drifts up to the window ledge. For a moment, it feels like being sealed inside a dream. You dress without speaking. When you open the door, the cold bites your face so sharply you gasp. Your spouse comes to stand beside you, cloak pulled tight. "Beautiful," you whisper, though you know it will mean more work, more worry. They don't answer, but their hand finds yours, cold fingers curling into your palm. And in that hush, you feel something you almost don't recognize. Something like gladness, because the snow can come. the hunger can come. You will face it together. When you step inside again, you close the door softly behind you, as if you're sealing out more than just the wind. You bank the fire. You pull the blankets over your shoulders. And when you finally sleep, you dream of nothing but the quiet weight of another hand in yours. Winter loosens its hold in the slowest way you can imagine. One dawn you wake to a hush that is not quite cold, not quite warm, just empty. You lie in bed, listening to your spouse's breathing, and try to decide if you trust it. The next morning, the frost is lighter on the threshold. By the end of the week, the snow has retreated into dirty ridges at the edge of the field. It feels like something the season is giving up reluctantly, like a dog dropping a bone. It isn't quite done chewing. You rise earlier, now that the sun comes sooner. You find yourself humming under your breath as you carry water, though you'd never admit it if anyone asked. Your spouse notices, though. You catch them watching you with that half smile they've developed this past year. The one that isn't quite teasing, but close. You're in a good mood, they say one morning as you set the pail by the door. You arch an eyebrow. Don't get used to it. They snort and go back to sorting beans. Historians still argue whether peasants felt relief or dread when winter ended, because it meant more work, but also more certainty. You know exactly how you feel. Tired, hopeful, and bracing yourself for everything that comes next. A mainstream fact, in many medieval communities, the arrival of spring was marked by Plough Monday, when everyone would gather to bless the tools and prepare the first furrows. Work was collective, solemn, and necessary, a reminder that survival depended on more than your own two hands. That first morning, you and your spouse go out to turn the soil. You feel an almost superstitious dread. You grip the spade like it might betray you. But as the blade sinks into thawed earth, something inside you unclenches. You don't have to look to know your spouse is feeling the same. You hear it in the quiet exhale they let out behind you. Later, you break bread on the stoop, too hungry to care that it's stale. For a few minutes, you say nothing. You just chew and listen to the wind stirring the last drifts of snow into muddy rivulets. You remember last spring? They ask after a while. You nod. I thought I'd made a mistake. Their gaze doesn't waver. So did I. You meet their eyes. The look between you feels like the slow, patient thaw itself. Something built over months of shared labor and the decision, again and again, not to leave. You don't say more, but you reach out and touch their wrist before you stand. That evening, you lie awake longer than usual, your body sore from turning frozen clods. You remember how it felt to be new here, to wonder if you'd ever belong. You remember the nights you stared at the ceiling and counted all the things you had lost. Now you count different things: the sacks of barley stacked against the wall, the eggs tucked under straw, the days you've endured together. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, couples would mark the start of the farming season by placing a sprig of green, bay or hazel, above their door. A promise to each other, and to whatever gods were listening, that they intended to stay. Your spouse does this the next morning. You watch them wedge a twig of new leaves over the lintel. When they look back at you, their expression is serious in a way that makes your chest ache. It's good luck, they say, as if they have to justify it. You nod. I know. The days lengthen, each one a little warmer. a little louder, with birds you'd almost forgotten existed. The work multiplies, mending fences, cleaning the ash from the chimney, rethatching the corner of the roof that collapsed under the snow's weight. You do it all without complaint. Or if you complain, you do it with a smile. At night, you share the same narrow bed, your limbs touching more often than not. You've stopped thinking about it as closeness you have to earn. Now, it just is. One evening, after the hearth is banked and the tools set aside, you sit together at the table. You pick at your supper, too tired to chew. After a while, your spouse reaches across the boards and lays their hand over yours. You don't pull away. "I'm glad you stayed," they say quietly. It's the first time they've spoken the thought aloud. Your throat tightens. You look at the scar on your knuckle, at the dirt under your nails, and you think of all the hours and small kindnesses that have brought you here. "Me too," you whisper. The quiet that follows feels like something sacred. When you finally rise and crawl into bed, you do it without the old hesitation. You lie on your side, facing them, and you let yourself rest in the certainty that whatever comes next, you'll face it together. The wind rattles the shutters, but you aren't afraid of it anymore. Tomorrow, the thaw will advance, the mud will deepen, the real work will begin, and you'll be ready. Because for the first time, you believe this isn't a life you're enduring. It's a life you're making. Spring doesn't come all at once. It never does. It sneaks in the way dawn does, shy at first, then all at once, too bright to ignore. You feel it in the softness of the soil under your boots, the dampness clinging to your hem, the weight that lifts from your ribs, even though you didn't realize you'd been carrying it. The first morning you rise to find the frost gone from the threshold, you step outside and stand very still, as if moving too fast might scare it back into hiding. The air smells of wet earth and something sweet you can't name. Inside, your spouse is stirring the embers into life. You watch them a moment, hair unkempt, hands steady, and you feel a pang so unexpected you press a hand to your chest. "What?" they ask without looking up. "Nothing," you say. Because you don't have a word for it. Historians still argue whether marriage could grow into affection when it started as obligation, whether duty and habit could soften into something that felt like grace. You suspect they could. You suspect you're proof. A mainstream fact. In medieval villages, the early weeks of spring were among the most dangerous. Food stores were nearly empty, new crops not yet ready, and illnesses often flared as the cold retreated. Yet this was also the season when hope crept back in, no matter how illogical. You spend the first thaw clearing debris, fallen branches, scraps of thatch blown off in winter storms, the last shriveled gourds you couldn't bring yourself to throw away. Your spouse works beside you without complaint. Sometimes you speak, but more often you don't. The silence between you is no longer something to endure. It feels like a familiar path you know by heart. One evening, after the day's labor has left your muscles aching, you share a meal at the table. The stew is thin, the bread nearly gone stale, but it tastes better than you expect. When you look up, you find them studying you over the rim of their cup. "What is it?" you ask. They shrug, but they don't look away. "You look different." You raise an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Like you're here?" they say softly. "Not just waiting to leave." You don't have an answer. Instead, you reach for their hand, your thumb brushing over the rough knuckles, and you think how strange it is that this feels more intimate than any kiss you've ever known. A quirky tidbit: some villages had the tradition of walking the fields together at the first full moon of spring, marking boundaries with stones and blessings. It was part superstition, part ritual, part gentle reminder. This is ours, and we are still here. You do something like that a week later. At dawn, you walk the edge of your small plot, stopping to set a stone upright where frost heave has tipped it over. You don't talk about why you're doing it. You don't have to. When you reach the far corner, you pause. The air smells of damp grass and thawing thatch. Your spouse glances at you, their expression quiet, questioning. "Feels different this year," you murmur. "How?" "Like it belongs to us now." Their mouth curves just enough to show they understand. Maybe it always did. Later, you plant the first rows of beans. Your hands are clumsy at first, cold and unsure, but you find your rhythm as the sun climbs higher. At midday, you sit side by side on a flat stone to share a scrap of cheese. Neither of you says much, but you keep finding reasons to glance over, as if to confirm this is really happening. That evening, you lie awake, listening to the wind moving through the eaves. You think about the first time you slept under this roof, how you watched the darkness and felt sure it would swallow you. Now, the dark feels like a shelter, a boundary you have chosen rather than one forced upon you. "Are you awake?" your spouse asks suddenly. You hesitate, then answer, "Yes." A pause. Then, "I'm glad it's you." Your heart stutters. "Why?" "Because you stayed," they whisper. "Even when you could have gone." You don't trust your voice, so you reach for them instead. Your hand finds theirs easily, as if it has always known where to land. Neither of you speaks again. But as you drift towards sleep, you feel something ease loose in your chest. Some old fear you hadn't realized you were still carrying. When morning comes, you rise together. You pull on your boots, side by side, and step out into the new season. The fields wait. The work waits. But for once, you feel ready. Ready to keep building this life. Ready to believe it might be yours to claim. The weeks slip past in a quiet procession of small, necessary tasks. You don't notice the change until one morning you wake and realize the wind has lost its bite. Instead, it smells of green things, damp soil, and that sweetness you can never name. You rise slowly, knees creaking, and watch your spouse lace their boots. There's no need to ask where they're going. The fields wait, just as they always have, and the season demands your hands whether you feel ready or not. Outside, the ground is soft underfoot. You pause at the threshold, breathing in the scent of thawed earth. A year ago, you would have felt dread, an ache in your ribs at all the labor ahead. Now, you only feel a kind of solemn relief, because you've learned that work can be its own sort of safety. Historians still argue whether peasants found meaning in toil or simply accepted it because there was no alternative. You think about this as you walk to the garden. You think about how your days have grown predictable, how every hour is accounted for, and how, against all expectation, you've come to love that steadiness. A mainstream fact, in medieval Europe, many villages held a ritual called beating the bounds, when neighbors would walk the parish borders together to remember what belonged to whom. It was part community, part memory, part quiet assertion of place. This year, You and your spouse decide to do the same, just the two of you. No ceremony, no blessing, just a slow walk around your small piece of earth, noting every fence post and worn stone. You don't speak much as you walk, but every so often, your hands brush. Neither of you pulls away. At the far corner of the plot, you stop. The light slants over the field, painting everything in gold. You rest your hand on the rough top of a boundary stone and feel the steadiness of it under your palm. Feels different now, you say softly. Your spouse glances at you. Different how? Like it's really ours. They don't answer right away, but when they do, their voice is low, certain. It is. Later that day, you mend the fence while your spouse checks the seed stores. You work in easy silence, breaking it only to pass each other tools or to point out a warped board. It's not until evening that you realize how natural it has become to share these hours without awkwardness. You sit across from each other at the table, eating stew that tastes mostly of salt and onions, and you feel something ease in your chest. A quirky tidbit. In some places, couples who had lived together a certain number of years, often 7 or 10, would renew their vows in a simple ceremony. No feast, no new clothes, just a public acknowledgement that they intended to keep choosing each other. You think of this as you watch your spouse push their bowl aside and lean back, studying you with that same unguarded expression you've learned to trust. What? You ask, voice gentler than you mean it to be. They shake their head, smiling faintly. Nothing. Tell me. Their eyes don't waver. Just, you look like yourself. You laugh, startled. I've always looked like myself. Not like this, they say, and there's no teasing in it. For a moment, you don't know where to look, so you busy yourself stacking the bowls, though your hands are clumsy. When you turn back, they're still watching you. Do you ever wish you'd chosen differently? You ask before you can stop yourself. No, they say without hesitation. Do you? You think about it, really think, about the hunger, the dark winters, the nights you lay awake with your heart clattering in your chest, and about mornings like this, when you wake to find their hand already searching for yours. No, you say quietly, not anymore. They nod once, as if that settles something. You bank the fire while they wash the bowls. You fold the same worn cloths you folded 100 times. You watch the lamplight play over the curve of their cheek and feel an ache that is not sorrow, but something closer to gratitude. When you crawl into bed, you don't bother to keep to your side. You lie close, your forehead resting against their shoulder, and breathe in the familiar scent of smoke and wool. They shift just enough to press their mouth to your temple. It isn't a kiss so much as a promise. You fall asleep thinking about how far you've come, about how love in this house has never been a thunderclap. It has been the slow work of staying, of choosing each other again and again, until the choosing became something you no longer questioned. And when morning comes, you rise together. You step outside to face the new season, your hands brushing as you cross the yard, not because you need the reassurance, but because you want it. And that, you realize, is the difference. Section 18. The year turns again, as it always does. You wake to dawn creeping over the threshold, pale and sure, brushing your cheek like a hand you forgot you missed. The air in the cottage feels softer than it did a year ago. Less of damp straw and worry, more of something like settled belonging. You stretch, feeling every joint complain, and you glance over to find your spouse already awake. They're sitting on the edge of the bed, tying their boots with the careful economy of someone who's performed the same motion 1,000 times. When they look back, their face is open in a way it never used to be. "Morning," they say, and the word lands like a blessing. You nod, swallowing around the thick warmth in your throat. Later, you stand together in the garden, hands on the low fence, surveying the rows you turned over the day before. You can see where the first green shoots are pushing through the damp earth. It is such a small thing, these sprouts no taller than your thumb, but you feel a surge of pride that surprises you. Historians still argue whether peasants found joy in their labors or simply endured them, because there was no alternative. You suspect it isn't either or. You think of all the days you've bent your back to the soil and hated the ache, and all the days you've paused to marvel that anything so fragile can grow in a world like this. A mainstream fact. In many villages, when the planting was finally finished, families would set aside one evening for a simple ritual: bread, ale, a prayer whispered over the seeds in the ground, a moment to acknowledge that no matter how skilled your hands, you were still at the mercy of weather and fate. This evening, you do something like that yourselves. You sit by the hearth with your supper, a crust of barley bread, a bit of cheese, a stew you both know you'll complain about later, and you talk. Not about debts or work or the coming summer, but about the first season you spent here, when neither of you knew how to meet each other's eyes without flinching. You laugh over it now, the way you wouldn't have dared then. "I thought you'd leave," you admit, watching the flames. Your spouse is silent a long moment before they answer. "I almost did," they say. "But then you looked at me that morning, the day we lost the ewe, and you didn't look angry, just tired. And I thought, maybe that was the same as forgiveness." You glance over, startled by the confession. "And now?" you ask, your voice thin with something you don't want to name. They meet your gaze, steady, unhurried. "Now I'm glad I stayed," they say. The quiet that follows isn't heavy. It's something close to relief. You finish your meal in companionable silence. When you bank the fire, you feel their hand brush your shoulder, light and deliberate. A touch that says more than any vow. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval couples who reached 10 years together would mark the date by exchanging small, practical gifts: an extra wool tunic, a new cooking pot. No poetry, no garlands, just the shared understanding that life is hard and anything that makes it easier is worth celebrating. In the morning, you leave the cottage together to walk the boundary stones. It isn't a ritual anyone else will witness, but you want to see the edges of your world, to remind yourselves of what you've held on to. The ground is damp under your boots. The breeze smells of turned soil and thawing thatch. Every few steps, you stop to clear a fallen branch or set a stone back upright. And each time, you feel their presence beside you like an answer to a question you stopped daring to ask. When you finish the circuit, you stand together by the gate. You don't say anything. You don't have to. The evening drifts down with a soft, inexorable hush you've come to love. You sit on the stoop, knees brushing, and watch the sky deepen into a color that feels like memory. "I used to wonder," you say eventually, voice low, "if I'd ever feel like this was home. And now?" You swallow. You don't look away. "Now I do." Their smile is small but certain. Good. Night deepens around you, cool and quiet. You don't rush to go inside. You savor this moment, this fragile, ordinary peace you've built. Because you know there will be harder seasons, storms and sickness and arguments you can't yet imagine. But you also know this: you'll meet them together. And somehow, that makes all the difference. When you finally rise, your bodies creak in the same places. You share the same ache and the same quiet triumph. You step inside, closing the door behind you, and the darkness feels less like an ending and more like a promise. You bank the fire, set out the bread for morning, and lie down with your foreheads nearly touching. And in that hush, you think, this is enough. This is everything. You close your eyes. You let the world fade. Tomorrow, you'll begin again. The air in the cottage has a different quality tonight. Less of smoke and worry, more of something you can't quite name. You lie still, feeling each slow breath unwind the tightness you've carried for years. Your spouse shifts beside you, their hand settling on your arm with a familiarity that is no longer surprising. You don't move away. You don't pretend it doesn't matter. You just breathe together, letting the hush settle like a blanket over your shoulders. Outside, the wind stirs the thatch, but it doesn't sound threatening anymore. Just a reminder that the world goes on beyond these walls, in all its mess and wonder. You think about the first nights here, the loneliness, the uncertainty, the raw fear that you'd never learn how to stay. You think of the moments you nearly turned away, the times when leaving would have been easier than trusting that something better could grow. And you remember too, all the small things that held you here when your heart felt too tired to try. A cup of broth, a warm cloak, a hand brushing yours when you thought no one would ever see you again. All those moments, so small you barely noticed, have become the shape of your life. You let your eyes drift shut, and the darkness feels safe. No watchers, no expectations, just the steady rise and fall of your breath and theirs. For a long time, you listen to the creak of the floorboards, to the quiet sigh of the embers, to the shared heartbeat that has become your anchor. This is the part no one ever writes songs about, the ordinary peace after the struggle, the relief of simply having made it through. No grand triumph, just this, a night without fear, a roof that holds, a life you chose to keep building. And it's enough. It is more than enough. Tomorrow, you'll rise before dawn again. You'll tend the animals, mend the tools, count the stores with the same cautious hope that has carried you this far. You'll argue over how much salt to put in the stew. You'll walk the field edges at dusk. And all of it, every chore, every quiet evening, will be part of something you built together. When you open your eyes once more, the stars are still there, cold and brilliant. You watch them until your vision blurs, until your thoughts slow to a soft, steady rhythm. You reach for their hand without thinking, and when your fingers find theirs, you feel something you can only call contentment. A promise, unspoken but undeniable. You made it. You stayed. And in all the small, unremarkable moments, you learned that love is not the loud declaration, but the quiet persistence. The simple act of staying again and again until the staying becomes devotion. As your breathing deepens, you feel the last remnants of tension slip from your shoulders. The night closes gently around you, and you let it. You are home, You are safe. Sleep well.